So I've gone through somewhat of a timeline of evolutionary thought, scientific evidence gathered, philosophies, and some of the people, a small number really of the people who have contributed to some of those aspects. Um, kept Charles Darwin out as separate, from those kind of leading up to all these sort of things leading up to him in a way, because we want to get at the idea of how some of those things influenced Charles Darwin. I'm not going to spend an extensive amount of time giving you the whole history and biography of Charles Darwin. There are many videos on Charles Darwin, all sorts of books on Charles Darwin's life. So if you have more interest in it, there's plenty of resources to look up. What I want to do is just point out a couple significant things about Darwin himself, about some of the things that he actually posed, proposed, and explained, and how they sort of came about, because there are also some misconceptions that are quite abundant about Charles Darwin and what he actually said. And so I want to try to clear up some of those for you based on some of the things that you do read, to kind of weigh that against some of the information I'm going to tell you. So, Charles Darwin, most everyone in the world has heard of him, is largely thought of as one of the most important thinkers and scientists of all time. And so why is that? All right, well, obviously because much of, say, our course in organismal biology is evolutionary based, in terms of we're going to do a lot of comparisons between groups of organisms, structures, features, physiological things, and along with molecular genetics and development that are very similar among organisms and things that are uniquely different among organisms, showing the relationships between them and the divergence, into different diverse groups. And we cover a lot of diversity, and the first part of the course is a lot of some mechanisms of how that diversity comes about. So Darwin didn't know anything about the mechanisms of genetics at that particular time, but made more observations through fossil record and living things and some others experiments that he did. There's a long period of time where there's a lot of experimentation and gathering up information to support his ideas. It's one of the differences between Charles Darwin and many of the people who came before him, who proposed ideas about evolutionary change. So that's, again, one of the very first things about Charles Darwin that is a incorrect misconception, that Charles Darwin proposed the theory of evolution. There were people, if you look back at our history, who discussed evolutionary change through time hundreds and hundreds of years before Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, discussed and proposed ideas of evolutionary change through time for living things. So this was not a novel idea or proposal from Charles Darwin. Okay? And in fact, we'll talk about this in a bit, that Charles Darwin avoided even using the term evolution for quite a long time. Right? And so what Darwin, why Darwin is known so well, is because of the evidence and the time that he spent gathering evidence to support his proposals and ideas. That's what sets him apart from many of these others who did not have actual mechanisms to propose, did not have data to support their conclusions. They just made observations and then drew some conclusion, which for many of them turned out to be accurate or correct, or some partially correct for some of the people. But they didn't really have the evidence to support it. Leonardo da Vinci is known for coming up with so many different ideas and things that he wrote in books that were never published. And he didn't necessarily prove them mathematically, but he wrote out all the observations and ideas. But because they weren't published and because they didn't have the necessary support, there's other physical laws and chemical laws attributed to other scientists, yet Da Vinci proposed those hundreds of years before those people did the work. The reason he's not credited with it and Darwin is credited with this is because Darwin did the work to support his conclusions. So this is kind of the why he's singled out and why he's thought of the way that he is. In addition to that, if you read or watch something, a documentary on the history of him, you'll often see that he's a very conflicted person in terms of his original, job was potentially going to be a clergyman. And at this time, you have to remember as well, and you could see this if you look at the historic aspect of it, many people who were natural historians who studied nature, plants and animals and these things were part of the clergy. That's kind of one of the things that they did. And so Darwin was just going to go into that particular path, right? And so his ideas, which then conflicted with, say, church teachings, caused him a lot of personal problems. And this is one of the things that spurred him to feel the need to gather so much information to support his ideas, because he knew other people wouldn't accept them, and he himself was fighting against what he was learning. He was saying, he would say things like, "This would unravel, our understanding of species if what I just observed was true." And so he said, "Well, is it? So let me gather more information." That's kind of the idea. So born in 1809, I don't necessarily have to know that. Eventually went off to school, gave his first scientific speech around 1827. Remember, Darwin studied geology with Sedgwick. I had in a previous lecture, and so he learned about identifying fossils and gradualism, also from reading about Lyell. And that's going to influence Lyell and Sedgwick. Were geologists who then influenced Darwin, as he was then selected to, after graduation, be the natural historian on a ship, the HMS Beagle, that was going on a trip around South America, and went around the world and stopped in, obviously the Galapagos Islands and Australia and a number of other islands, but it spent a lot of time in South America, and it was a 5-year voyage. So this is the thing that really made Darwin then famous. So he really just graduates from school right before he goes on this trip. And so at the time he's reading, and then he's going out collecting fossils. I mean, he was a hunter, and so he would go and collect animals and just observe interesting, unique features that they had. He would start to observe unique things that they had, different than animals in England, but also similarities between them. And so this was just striking to him. Oh, these things are similar, yet they're different. That's interesting. And that was really all it was. But then he started to notice things like fossilization in rocks. He started to find, 40 feet above sea level. So 40 feet above sea level. He noticed marine fossils, so fossil shells, so marine snail fossils. And the idea is, how in the world would the fossils of these marine animals be found so high up above sea level? Not only how would they get up there, but then they died up there and stayed up there, and the idea is that the sea level was higher. And so this was also something that that correlated with proposals by Lyell and gradualism, that there would be change over time. There was change in the fossil record over time. That is evidenced through the rock layers, and then also in the organisms preserved in the layers of rock. And so Darwin started noticing more and more about the fossils and collecting a large number of fossils. And so when he came back to England, this is one of the reasons why he became very well known at that time, not because of specific proposals he made, but just as a natural historian of collecting massive amounts of collections of animals, plants, and fossils from this voyage of the Beagle, which many of them he kept to himself and some he shared with other people. And so many people would come to him to then also study. He studied the fossils and organisms that he collected. And so he was really well known for that. But it was during this voyage where he started to form a lot of these ideas and ask a lot of these questions about, it seems that some things appear in the fossil record and some things disappear. How is that? Some of these organisms on some of these islands, they seem very alike yet very different, and they're adapted, and so to their particular environment. That some are very well adapted to, and then some are not adapted. If you were to transport them to a different environment, they wouldn't be. Yet they all share other similarities. So how could that be, or how did that all come about? And so correlating living things that were different and unique, yet similar, with fossil record of organisms that were different and unique from one another, but also similar to living things today and other things that lived before them that seem to have disappeared, he started to form a lot of these ideas about this gradual change over time in living things. And so he then starts to propose, ideas that there is descent with modification. So I'll talk about that for a second. Everyone should be very familiar with just this idea. What does descent with modification mean? Well, it's just the idea is you have parents and they are somewhat like you, but somewhat different. You descended from your parents. They descended from their parents, your grandparents, but they're not exactly the same. You're not clones of your parents and they're not clones of your grandparents. They're different. With descent comes modification. A lot of these things have been known for a very long time as well, through what we'll refer to as artificial selection in farming. So there were people agriculturally who were breeding plants to select for features in the offspring. So the descendants of some groups of plants were modified or different as a population because the breeders selected certain features. And with animals as well, and farm animals, domesticated animals, people would select for a feature to create more domesticated organisms. And that is descent with modification. So over time, the organisms become different. Features are selected for by humans. What Darwin proposes then as a mechanism, ultimately, is that nature can do the same thing. That environmental conditions that might be extreme in one environment and very extremely different in another environment, that's what's doing the selection. That's what's doing the guiding, that the organisms are very diverse and that nature, through stress and challenges and competition, selects for certain features. The other thing that led to this was, again, I mentioned in the other history talk, Malthus, who studied really economy, and populations, said that increases in population would lead to, competition among individuals for resources. He was talking more about people, but Darwin proposed that would hold true for anything. So all organisms need nutrients and resources and habitats, and as their populations would grow and they would start to merge with other populations, there would be competition among them, and organisms with features that could help them survive or outcompete the others would do better. They would have more offspring and they would pass on. So that's what natural selection is, really the mechanism of how organisms then change over time. If there's no selective force, if there's no pressure, then there's no change. So we'll get into the Hardy-Weinberg Equilibrium, the idea that we'll talk about frequencies of alleles within a population and how we can measure them. And if they stay the same over time, that means the population is in what we call equilibrium and there's no evolution occurring, probably no selection happening because conditions are very favorable and stable. And there's not a lot of competition or stress. But when there is competition or stress, then some selective force will work on that diverse population. It's also the reason why we'll study a little bit of the genetics to get at how does genetic diversity arise in the first place? Where does it all come from at the cellular level, cellular and molecular level? Darwin, again, didn't know these things at the time, but it's just proposing that from knowing that organisms do breed and then they do have offspring and the offspring are different than the parents, and this would happen in nature as well. So he goes on the voyage of the Beagle, comes back. We have about 6 years go by, and one of the first significant publications that Darwin has is on coral reefs. So really our understanding of coral reef structure today really comes from Charles Darwin. Quickly explain an idea to you, is that, this is the ocean surface, and then this is a shoreline going down to deeper waters. Corals are organisms that have symbiotic algae within them called zooxanthellae, and the zooxanthellae require light for photosynthesis. So the corals have to grow in shallow waters. We don't see the corals growing in deeper waters. There are places in the ocean called atolls, where essentially there are rings of corals or coral reef, and sort of like a lagoon in the middle, this circular area. And so large questions about how would that ever happen or how would that ever form. And the idea is that there were volcanic islands that over time sunk. And as the island sunk, or as the sea level would rise, or both happening at the same time, these organisms would potentially die and leave their skeletons behind, and then new corals would be built on top of them so that they can be up into the shallow areas. And as which we do know happens, some of the volcanoes do sink, and we do know that also sea levels have changed over time, that eventually what happens is that then we get these coral reefs being barriers to islands, and then eventually turning into these atolls. And so Darwin, from making his observations on the voyage of the Beagle, proposed this idea, which we then years later test and gather up more information on and find, yes, that is the way things actually work, and that's how coral reefs are built, and that's how some of these structures that happen from coral reefs come about. So that's one of the first things Darwin was actually known for. Darwin then, in 1845, so this is about almost 10 years after coming back from the voyage of the Beagle, publishes a book on the Galapagos finches. And really, this is one of the first things it really starts to get into. So this one's about change over time, so coral reefs, that the islands change and that the corals, the reefs change and as the organisms grow. The finches have a lot more to do with descent, okay? Because the proposal here is that there was some common ancestral finch, and that it then gave rise, potentially based on habitat, to a variety of different types of finches that were all noted more so through beak type. So some having massive beaks, some having more neutral sort of size and shaped beaks, some having very thin beaks, maybe for feeding between spines of a cactus or eating particular insects, whereas others would break seeds but the other similarities of the finches indicated that they all were related in some way and all really related to some ancestral species. So again, some of these ideas of descent and descent with modification were being proposed as he's publishing other work on specific things, on finches. Darwin comes up with this idea of natural selection as a mechanism for descent with modification, but doesn't publish that work. Instead, he spends the next, almost, it's not quite 2 decades, but almost 20 years or so, it's really more than 20 years since the voyage of the Beagle, gathering information. So Darwin does breeding studies of plants. He has other botany publications at the time. So he's kind of studying, again, descent and inheritance patterns, and how, again, trying to explain mechanisms of change. He studies more of the fossils, and he does a variety of different types of work and discusses this with other people, and he has his idea and he continues to write and form, but not publish the work. In 1858, Alfred Russel Wallace sends Charles Darwin a paper that he is proposing to publish on natural selection as a mechanism of descent with modification, of change through time, based on his evidence collected from a variety of different places, some of the same ones that Darwin had gone to. And Darwin realizes that he's been working on this for over 20 years, and now Russell is going to publish this paper and become famous for it, and Darwin is not. So instead, they, in 1858, make a presentation, a joint presentation. So it's Wallace and Darwin that together who really propose natural selection with their combined evidence as a short paper. Then in 1859 is when Darwin publishes the larger volume of his book on the origin of species. things to keep in mind is that Darwin continued to work on this and refine his idea and gather up more evidence, and he continued to publish more and more editions of the book, and those editions changed slightly over time with more information that he added to them, and even some of the language he used changed. Darwin is well known for this survival of the fittest. I say this all the time. People talk about evolution, Charles Darwin, but this was not included until the 5th edition. So the 5th edition of On the Origin of Species was the first time Darwin ever said or mentioned anything about survival of the fittest. And again, fittest, people often, it's one of those misconceptions, viewed in people think about it as the strongest. That's not what it means, or not what he meant necessarily. It means most well adapted and most likely to both reproduce and have offspring and have more offspring. So biological fitness is about having offspring. Strongest organism could have no offspring, and that means it has zero fitness. So keep that in mind. It's not about physical fitness, which could come into play. It's about reproduction. That's what fitness is about. All right. So survival of the fittest also does not mean the individual who is the strongest survives. Again, that's one of the things we often say. That's not what is meant by this. Survival of the fittest means that genes from a species or a group of organisms survive into another generation because they have lots of offspring. Okay, that's really talking about. Now, yes, individuals who are more well adapted to reduced water supply, or a change in their diet, or competition from other organisms competing for the same resource, or able to escape predators. Those individuals who survive then reproduce and pass on their genes, and it's the genes that are surviving into future generations. So keep in, again, it's the survival, big picture, it's the survival of genes into future. He doesn't know the term genes yet. Darwin doesn't. But it's the idea of inherited traits or characteristics survive into the next generation, the characteristics that enable those individuals that are part of a species, of a population, to do well or do better than others because they have beaks that can eat these little insects, and these guys can't because they can't get at them, where the insects are hiding between little spines. So it's those sorts of things that then allow them to survive as a group and allows the characteristics and traits to survive on in future generations. So kind of just keep that sort of thing in mind. Darwin doesn't use the word evolution even until the 6th edition. So it's the 6th edition that he uses the word evolution. So Darwin does use the word evolution. Some people say, oh, he never used the word evolution. And some people talk about his theory of evolution as that that's what the idea was, and that's what he stated from the start. Both of them are not true or partially true. So yes, Darwin used the term evolution in the book On the Origin of Species, but not until a much later version of the book as well. Darwin was trying to stay away from discussions of man, because that's where most of the attacks, all on the origin of species and natural selection and descent and modification, a lot of people didn't have much of a problem with other things, other the plants, with different types of animals, worms and snails and insects changing potentially over time. Some people did have issues with that there was no such thing as change. Everything is just exactly as it is and never changes. It's immutable. Again, with all the fossil evidence accumulated from such a very long period of time and having so much of it, a lot of people really have to be somewhat blind to not recognize or see that, or they're just deliberately refusing to accept overwhelming amounts of information. But the next step in the origin of species and is, say, of the human species, and This is where people took a lot of offense with it and didn't agree and attacked then Darwin a lot more because of that. And so he spent quite a bit of time trying to avoid it and being very upset about it in general, even personally, just not even wanting to accept it himself, but looking at evidence and saying, I can't explain it otherwise, that this is how things must be. And then eventually writes a book, Descent of Man, which talks much more about human evolution and descent. In addition, with this book is where Darwin introduces and supports more of the evidence of sexual selection. It's really kind of a form of, say, natural selection. Natural selection is just nature itself, where sexual selection is more individuals within a population having preferential mating. So looking at certain features. So especially in birds, you can see like in a peacock has massive tail feathers to attract mates. And a lot of birds have plumage and coloration and songs that are all learned to attract mates. And so that selection of a mate is something that will then select for certain genes, again, that would pass on, or characteristics or traits that would pass on. And there's competition for mates, and that Darwin then proposed this. And this is something his grandfather, Erasmus, talked about actually a little bit, but didn't demonstrate or collect any information on evidence to support. But this is something that Charles did, is collect information to support it. And then Charles Darwin then died in 1882. Okay? And so, but again, people are continue to read Darwin's work and discuss Darwin, and he's part of most every biology course, a lot of biology curricula. Many courses are all have an evolutionary basis of how a lot of the courses fit together. When people look at a curriculum and how things fit and how things connect, it comes back to a lot of these sorts of connections. So you should know a few of the key dates, for Darwin, especially the Voyage of the Beagle, publication of On the Origin of Species, and a few other characteristics or events that happened that kind of led up to that, such as noteworthy things like a proposal of the formation of coral reef atolls, his modification of the finches and so on, Darwin's drawings of things like, we talk about cladograms and phylogenetic trees. This really came from a lot of his earlier drawings and work as well. So we're just kind of setting Darwin apart from everyone else, and you should spend a little bit of extra time. These often whole chapters in the book just on his biographies.